In the 1970s, the Indiana Pacers were one of the most successful franchises in pro basketball, dominating the ABA and being considered one of its best franchises. But by the time the Pacers entered the NBA, they were several years removed from their last championship and were struggling financially. But going into the 1979 to 1980 season, I don't think most people knew they would be entering the worst era of Pacers basketball. The Pacers have 8 seasons in the entire history of their franchise that they have lost 50 or more games. 5 of those 8 came during the 1980s. The Pacers only have 2 seasons of 60 or more losses, and both of them came during the 1980s. But why? Why were the Pacers so horribly bad during this time period? It wasn't just because the NBA was more difficult than the ABA. As I have talked about in previous videos, plenty of ABA teams smoothly transitioned from the ABA to the NBA. It was because the previous core of the great 70s Pacers were gone. The only one who remained by the 79 to 80 season was George McGinnis, who was in the twilight of his career and spent the last few years in Philadelphia before returning to Indianapolis. But who did they trade to get him? Future Hall of Famer Alex English. Yeah, that basically puts into perspective how badly ran this team was. The Pacers during the 1980s made the playoffs 3 times. They lost in the first round every time. They got swept all but once when they managed to win 1 game the whole series. They finished last in their division 6 times. Now you might be wondering, if the Pacers were so bad, they must have gotten some great draft picks. So who did they draft during all of this? Well, in 1979, they selected Dudley Bradley, 13th overall. He would be a pretty good defender, earning an all-defensive second-team selection in just his 2nd season. But he was traded for draft picks after only playing 2 seasons with the Pacers. None of those picks in Indy ever really amounted to much. In 1980, the Pacers didn't have a first-round pick at all. And in 1981, they picked Herb Williams 14th overall. You've probably heard of Herb Williams because he played in the NBA until he was 40. If you've ever gone through Basketball Reference and looked through just random teams between the 1980s to the 1990s, you've probably seen his name pop up. He was actually a pretty good pick for Indy, playing almost 600 games for the Pacers and averaging 15 points and almost 8 rebounds a game, along with 2 blocks per game. Now, there were better players than Herb selected later on, but overall this was a pretty good pick. In 1982, the Pacers selected Clark Kellogg 8th overall. Kellogg would make an impact immediately, averaging 20 points and 10 rebounds per game as a rookie. He would put up similar stats for the next few years, until he started having injury problems, forcing him to retire at just 25 years old. In 1983, it was a pretty similar story, sadly. The Pacers, coming off just a 20-win season, would select Steve Stipanovich 2nd overall. Steve would have a solid career, averaging 13 points and almost 8 rebounds. But sadly, his career was cut short due to injuries, forcing Steve to retire at just 28 years old. And guys like Dale Ellis, Derek Harper, Clyde Drexler, and Craig Elo were all available when Indy picked 2nd. In 1984, the Pacers should have selected 2nd overall, but they traded their pick to Portland a few years earlier. This means that the Pacers could have had Michael Jordan. So add that to the list of things that Pacers fans can cry about at night. I mean, it's up there with the Kawhi Leonard pick, but this isn't nearly as known, which is really weird because you'd think more people would talk about this, you know, the Pacers possibly being able to pair Michael Jordan and Clyde Drexler and Reggie Miller all together, but it's not really talked about very much. So in 1984, we did have a first-round pick. We got Vern Fleming 18th overall, who wasn't really bad for the Pacers, but considering what we could have had, it's just not ideal. In 1985, the Pacers selected 2nd overall once again, picking Wayman Tisdale. Wayman was developing into a solid player for the Pacers, not really 2nd overall pick level, but he was still pretty good. However, the Pacers traded him in his 4th season to the Kings. He would go on to have several 20-point-per-game seasons. The Pacers could have drafted any number of other players who would become great NBA players. 2 future Pacers in Detlef Schrempf and Chris Mullin. AC Green and Joe Dumars were available, but possibly the biggest whiff of all was that Karl Malone was still available. By this point, the Pacers could have built a big 3 of Clyde Drexler, Michael Jordan, and Karl Malone. But there is still more. In 1986, the Pacers would select Chuck Person 4th overall. This is actually a pretty good pick. While Mark Price and Jeff Hornacek were still available, they weren't drafted until the 2nd round. So given the circumstances, selecting a guy who would go on to play 6 seasons in Indy and be around a 20-point-per-game scorer and 6-rebound-per-game guy during his time is a pretty good pick. 1987 was the only year where the Pacers without a doubt got the best value of their pick, selecting the greatest Pacer of all time, Reggie Miller, 11th overall. But 1988 is an interesting draft to look back on. The Pacers selected a franchise legend in Rick Smits 2nd overall, and while you could argue he was kind of a bust with Mitch Richmond being available, it's hard to say that Smits was a bad pick considering what he did for the Pacers franchise. So the verdict on that pick is kind of just dependent on how you feel about Rick Smits. And finally, in 1989, the Pacers selected George McCloud 7th overall. He would end up being a bust, as he never averaged more than 10 points per game in his 4 seasons with the Pacers, and with plenty of better players left to select. So, as you can see, the draft was a big reason why the Pacers were bad in the 1980s. They missed on way too many picks to build a good team. Now, did the Pacers have some decent seasons in the 1980s? Yes, they did. As I mentioned earlier, they made the playoffs 3 times from the 1979-80 season to the 89-90 season. But their overall record during that time was 359 wins to 534 losses. That is good for 184 games under 500, and a winning percentage of .398. They finished last in their division 6 times and never finished higher than 3rd. The best season they had that whole decade was the 1980 to 1981 season, where they went 44-38. The Pacers have only missed out on the playoffs 21 times in their NBA history. 7 of those times came during the 1980s. These teams were the worst basketball Pacers fans have ever experienced. But even though we were horrible, we still had our heroes. Chuck Person was nicknamed the Rifleman, and everyone knew Clark Kellogg would have been great if he never got hurt. Vern Fleming stuck with the Pacers so long, he went from some of the worst seasons in franchise history to some of its bests. Indiana still loved its Pacers, and this was a decade where Indy also saw the Colts move here. And we loved the Colts too, even though they only made the playoffs once during the 1980s. Our teams were horrible, but we still made heroes of them. It was an interesting time here, and a time that has kind of started to be forgotten by most fans. But it's similar to what we have now. The Pacers, coming off some great years in the 2010s, now have a young, revitalized team after going through some rough times the past few seasons. Now they look poised to build something special. And the Colts, also coming off of some great years in the 2010s, with an admittedly bad team, but still filled with plenty of young talent. History will once again repeat itself in the 3-1-7. Hopefully with the Pacers leaving with a little more than last time. I'm Limitless Polls. Thank you guys for watching. Sorry that I haven't been getting more content like this out. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. It took a decent amount of research to make and stuff like that, but I've always thought of this time in Pacers history as like a really weird time. Nobody really talks about it, so kind of wanted to make a video on it so that somebody would talk about it, because no one really talks about how bad these teams were. I'll see you guys next time.
Never ever will I fold, even if my clothes wrinkled. Bitch ain't single, but this kid'll make a whole me. You done made the roster, if that throw go make my toes tingle.